Yes? Okay. My interest in ritual goes back many years, but it's been galvanized over the past 12 years or so by my exposure to a ritual form of therapy called family and systemic constellation therapy, or family constellations for short. The highly anomalous effects that I have seen in the context of constellation therapy has raised so many questions for me in terms of how we understand personal identity, the question of consciousness itself, and even the deep structures of reality. So I'm going to come to the details of that with a real case. And throughout this talk, I want to keep the thing as grounded as possible in actual cases, because if I just were to summarize the lessons from those cases, they'd be too astounding for anyone to accept, including myself. So from the details, we need to work out. What I've done with this talk is, first of all, I'll address a real case of family constellations that I've documented in my recent book, The Healing Field. And then I wanted to compare that with some extremely anomalous accounts from the ethnographic record. These are classic accounts which are well known, well documented, and to try and see if there are any commonalities or similarities between these cases that are going to throw light on these strange accounts. I don't know how to describe them really. They're experiences that have arisen in ritual contexts which don't seem to fit in any of our conceptual models. Okay. They're outliers. The therapy called family constellation therapy was developed by psychiatrist and psychotherapist Dr. Bert Hellinger, and he did this from a mixture of family therapy and traditional African healing practices. He worked for some years in South Africa, so there's an element of Zulu ritual practice combined with Western family therapy. So, like family therapy, it sees the family as the context for understanding a person's issues. But unlike conventional therapy, it views the family context as possessing very deep roots, running back into the ancestral past and propagating an influence through to today. Now you can immediately see we don't really have a concept or language or understanding that can make sense of this. Nevertheless, it is the lived experience of people who work or participate in this therapy, and it's very widespread right now throughout Europe. I think almost every city you'll find constellation therapy going on almost every day of the week, so it's a very widespread movement. The way the therapy works is that a group of people who generally are unknown to each other assemble with a facilitator. And whoever has a particular issue that they want to resolve, these are often issues which have been through a number of therapies without finding satisfaction. People are not normally diving for stuff like family constellation therapy as their first choice. It's normally come after a number of interventions, including conventional psychotherapy. That person will have an issue that they want to resolve, and then they'll select people at random almost from the available volunteers to represent key members of their family. Okay? They will then arrange them in the central space in a way which seems symbolically appropriate to them. That's to say that whether they're facing each other or facing away, whether they're close together or there's a distance between them. They'll set up a symbolic representation of how they see their family functioning. Now, if you've ever been to one of these therapies, you'll know that something very strange happens when they complete this symbolic representation. You all of a sudden feel an energy. You feel a distinctive emotional overlay. As to say, you're fully aware of yourself, of your surroundings, you have full cognitive control, But all of a sudden you feel an emotional overlay which has nothing to do with your own feelings. Okay? It's very strange. Those emotions can be very extreme. You may suddenly feel strong hatred or sorrow or anger, and yet it has nothing to do with your own situation. The therapist then goes through the pattern of those relationships and resolves them. Okay? And they do that in the only way possible, which is to come to terms with how that person's feeling and finding the reason for it. According to Bert Hellinger, the family system has at its heart a group conscience that regulates innocence and guilt. Considered from any perspective, it's an extraordinary claim. It leaves me with at least four questions that I would want to have answered. How are affective conflicts and traumas propagated from generation to generation to impact the health and well-being of current and future generations? What is the medium of transmission? How can a therapeutic intervention spontaneously reconstitute the originating conflicts and traumas, even if those people are not present? Okay? They may well be long dead. And finally, how can a therapeutic intervention resolve them in real time without the parties to the original conflicts being present? So this is an extremely problematic form of therapy, and yet people experience it as highly effective. The studies that I have, there seems to be a consensus amongst the people who've looked at this therapy, who've researched it, that it is effective. And I can quote about half a dozen studies of family constellation as a therapy. They've assessed it for its effectiveness. So the following account details an informant's first-person perspective on their own family constellation. A little background is in order. This was a woman who, since the birth of her child, had a strong fear that the child would die, even though there were no medical reasons for her to have that fear. Okay? And this fear was going on for 10, 12 years without being able to find a solution to it. So she decided to try family constellations, and this is her account of her experience, okay, dealing with this. She had set the family pattern up, selected volunteers, complete strangers, put them into position in the central space to symbolically represent the pattern of family relationships. And she said, I quote, "The person who represented my mother stood looking at the floor as if searching for something. The person who represented me was standing next to her, her hands held out as though waiting to receive something." Okay, this was the start position. The therapist then asked the person representing the mother what she was looking for, and she said there had to be more babies. The therapist told me this meant there must be some dead babies that were not acknowledged within this family group. She placed some pillows on the floor to represent these. Then the therapist asked if any of the babies had actually been born. And this woman's mother had had a child who had died one day after birth. Okay? She had never seen her own daughter. So the therapist brought someone else to stand before the mother and said, "Here's your daughter, look at her." Okay. The person representing my mother said, "I can't look at her because I never saw her." So this person has now extracted information about this family that they could not possibly have access to. There's no briefing given. Nobody's acting here. It's a pattern of symbolic relationships that represents that family's, what is it? A group energy? but it has an information content to it. It's not just emotion. There's information in this field. She says she was shocked. The woman who didn't even know my mother was talking with her mannerisms, saying things the way she would say them, and now she was telling us she had never seen her daughter. It was true. For medical reasons, my mother had never seen her last daughter. Then the therapist began to line women up behind this person, representing her mother, my great-grandmother, and so on. Tracing the lineage of women in our family on my mother's side, about 8 women down the line. Now, on an average calculation of some 30 years per generation, roughly, we're talking about someone now who lived 250 years ago. Okay. About 8 women down the line, she came across the blockage in the female energy. As I watched, I understood that the fear I had had since the birth of my son, the fear that he was certain to die, was not mine, but energy carried through the women in my family. And the person representing me in the constellation was now standing with their arms open, ready to receive that fear. You remember the initial setup position. She was waiting for something. Then and there I decided I was not going to accept that energy. The therapist put her into her own position in the constellation at this point, and she refused to accept the fear. A couple of weeks later, she says, my fear for my son had almost completely disappeared. Okay. So it's the resolution of a 10, 12-year-old, very strong emotional fear in one session. Probably took about 30, 40 minutes maximum. This account is just one of, I don't know, hundreds of thousands or thousands occurring every day of the week across Europe. They are therefore normative within the context of this type of therapy. Okay. This type of therapy is not normative in the context of our normal concepts and ideas about reality, and that's the problem. What insights can we derive from cases like this? I would like to suggest 5 main points that we need to be aware of. To anyone attending a constellation, it's quite clear that you're dealing with strong field effects. The sensations and energy within the constellation emerge quickly once the representatives are all in place. Okay? The symbolic reenactment of a pattern of relationships is capable of reconstituting the mental, emotional, and even the physical posture of the people being represented. I just re-emphasize, these are complete strangers. They're volunteers selected at random from a group. We saw the representative representing the client's mother spontaneously adopt her mannerisms and access the knowledge that she'd not seen her newborn daughter. So accurate are these representations, that's my third point, sorry. If a key member is left out, the field will indicate their absence and their place within the constellation. Again, we saw this when the person representing the client's mother felt an absence and was looking for someone else, saying there have to be more babies. There's the awareness there. The symbolically, point 4, symbolically reconstituted field is amenable to harmonization of its negative effects in real time. By placing the client into her own constellation, and they are then refusing to accept the legacy of fear, the inherited negative effect was neutralized, and the family and ancestral field harmonized. Finally, point 5, symbolic resolution of long-standing traumas and ethical conflicts leads to the actual amelioration or removal of the related problems of family members here and now. Okay. After the constellation, the client's fear rapidly diminished until it became insignificant. So, I want to draw 3 or 4 conclusions from this. I can emphasize, I mean, my own training is in academic philosophy, analytic philosophy, philosophy of science, formal logic. So you can imagine how extraordinary and how unbelievable I found these things to be myself. So I understand just how much difficulty we have with the reality. The ritual of itself is sufficient to reconstitute the consciousness slice of a specific time and place. This contradicts everything that mainstream thought says about the nature of consciousness, of course. Secondly, for this to be possible, the relevant information must already be coded, so to speak, in a place where it continues to exert an influence down through the generations. For this reason, Dr. Albert Marr has called it a knowing field. Thirdly, ordinarily fields are extensional objects. They have quantitative, that's to say, measurable properties. But in this case, in talking about a field, we're talking about an intentional field. It is a store of coded effect, ethical dilemma, and information on the personal dispositions of the people in an extended network. Needless to say, no such field is recognized or even suspected in any mainstream field of study. Fourthly, while we've been concerned with the family and ancestral network, we could just as easily reconstitute any other system or network of relations, for example, those of an organization. And that's where the subtitle of systemic constellations comes from. This type of work is done within organizations as well, for the purposes of conflict resolution. But if such easily convened therapeutic rituals can demonstrate such pronounced anomalous effects which lie at the heart of its therapeutic efficacy, surely we should see references to them in the ethnographic record. After 150 years of anthropology's obsession with ritual, there must be traces in the ethnographic record of these field effects. So I propose to very, very briefly explore two rituals from the ethnographic record. They're well-known rituals. There are over half a dozen I could have used that I found, but the two I've chosen is one by Edith Turner and another by Bruce Grindle. So Edith Turner's case was of a Ndembu healing ritual, I think in Zambia. Her account of that ritual stands in stark contrast to that of her husband, Victor Turner, who did extensive structural analysis of the Ndembu healing ritual. Edith Turner's approach to the ritual was different. Rather than analytic, she empathized strongly with the person who was undergoing the healing ritual. She identified with them, and she wanted a positive result. So you could say she moved away from being participant observer into something far more radical. Participant or radical participant, I don't know how you'd want to express it. But I think that emotional shift enabled her to then participate in the ritual on a deeper level than you would normally see. She says, I quote, I felt the spiritual motion, a tangible feeling of breakthrough through the whole group. She then witnessed the ritual unfold and was able to see, if that's the right word, what the rite was attempting to accomplish on a level that was otherwise inaccessible to her. She appears to have witnessed at first hand the invisible reality, in this case the removal of a spirit attachment, the remnant of a deceased person. She describes how the healer's hands were working and scrabbling on the back, and how I saw with my own eyes a giant thing emerging out of the flesh of her back. The thing was a large grey blob about 6 inches across, a deep grey opaque thing emerging as a sphere. Her comment on her experience was that I knew the Africans were right. There is spirit stuff. There is spirit affliction. It is not a matter of metaphor and symbol or even psychology. The second, I mean, this is a well-known case in anthropology, I think. The second case I'd like to comment on is a death divination ritual which Bruce Grindle experienced. He was not invited to the ritual. In fact, he was told not to attend it, but he managed to get into it. What he witnessed was also preceded by a sudden and profound psychophysical experience and an equally profound shift in his awareness. He describes how, as the ritual progressed, he says, "At first I thought that my mind was playing tricks with my eyes, so I cannot say when the experience first occurred. But it began with moments of anticipation and terror, as though I knew something unthinkable was about to happen. The anticipation left me breathless, gasping for air. In the pit of my stomach, I felt a jolting and tightening sensation which corresponded to moments of heightened visual awareness. Then I felt my body become rigid, my jaws tightened, and at the base of my skull I felt a jolt, as though my head had been snapped off my spinal column. At this, a terrible and beautiful sight burst upon me. Stretching from the amazingly delicate fingers and mouths of the ritual performers, strands of fibrous light played upon the head, fingers and toes of the dead man. The corpse, shaken by spasms, then rose to its feet, spinning and dancing in a frenzy." Those experienced with such modalities as Kundalini Yoga may well recognize these psychophysical symptoms and therefore understand just how powerful the energy field generated by the ritual was. In some way, in Grindle's own words, he has never fully recovered from the events of that night. Of his experience, he said, "The canons of empirical research limit reality to that which is verifiable through the consensual validation of rational observers. An understanding of death divination must depart from these canons and assume that reality is relative to one's consciousness of it." Of his experience some 14 years later, he said, "It wounded and sickened my soul." And I can only assume it's because he was in such an intense energy field. It's difficult to know how to deal with these cases. There are 5 points, I think, that we need to bear in mind when we attempt to make sense of this stuff. Firstly, their intersubjective nature. Other people appear to have seen the same thing. That's a problem. The complex continuity of narrative that they involve. I know of no psychological mechanism that can explain that. They're localized and specific. They do not occur either before or after the ritual event itself. They're normative within their own society or group. They're not considered to be anomalous. And they exhibit cross-cultural commonalities and similarities, recognizable patterns in other culture. Pass on, we have 5 minutes left. This leaves us in search of the answers to 6 key questions. What is the nature of the energy generated by ritual or healing ritual? What gives rise to it? In what does its efficacy reside? How does it affect us physically? What is its role in shifting the quality and depth of our awareness? And how does it provide access to a reality that is otherwise invisible? So, by far the most fundamental problem with this is that we seem to lack a conception or model of the body itself beyond the biomedical body of modern medicine. As we've seen, the paradigm of biomedical body is not sufficient to encompass the full spectrum of the body's potentialities. And so it generates anomalies out of routine experiences of people worldwide. Okay? The extraordinary experiences we've heard about are not anomalous in their own context, they're normative. They're anomalous to us, so there's some disengagement here, and I think it's because our underlying conception of the human being and of the human body must be faulty. What other bodies are there? There is, of course, the Eastern or yogic body, an anatomy of energy meridians and energy flows. This body was nearly a universal model from at least the Neolithic, if not earlier. The energy body still provides the dominant anatomical model in large parts of the world and within most alternative regimes of healing. But despite the growing body of evidence for its actual as opposed to metaphorical existence, it remains firmly outside mainstream biomedicine and therefore fails to provide an acceptable model within the social sciences. As a result, many routine phenomena are categorized as anomalous. The ritual language of traditional societies harks back to pre-modernity, and our problem is that we can no longer adopt a pre-modern world view. There is no way back for us. We therefore need fresh language and new ways of conceptualizing. In fact, fresh language and concepts do already exist and have started to be deployed. Philosopher of anthropology Jose Gil has pioneered the application of several key insights derived from the work of philosopher Gilles Deleuze. Gil's insights encompass the arenas of both ritual and performance, though more specifically modern dance. At root, ritual is embodied performance. It is not the symbols employed, but the people deployed who generate its transformative force. Through the pioneering work of people like Merce Cunningham, the language of dance has been deconstructed, stripped bare of its narrative and expressive elements, leaving nothing except the movement of the dancer in response to the flow of their own energy. This has the effect of emphasizing and making explicit the energetic dynamics of performance. And Jose Gil, I quote him, he says, "The dancer evolves in a particular space, different from an objective space. The dancer does not move in space, rather the dancer creates space with movement. A new space emerges. We will call it the space of the body. The space created by the body is characterized by its depth, its texture, density, viscosity, its speed, and the impact on our sense of duration, which is alternatively dilated and contracted. The secretion of such fields involves a displacement or emptying out of the performer. A contemporary dancer compares the space extruded or exfoliated from herself to a cocoon spun from the threads of her own being. I like the feeling, I quote, I like the feeling of the texture of cocoons. A cocoon produces numerous threads. The threads come out so fast that my body is often left behind, and at such times my body is empty. I wonder where my stomach and other organs have gone. All that's left of me is contours. A critical point is that accounts like this are neither metaphors nor are they merely accounts of the dancer's subjective experience. They attempt to put into words the creation of a unique kind of space through and around the performer. The healing processes we have reviewed are, on one level, social and cultural performances. It's not just that of social reality. This is a unique space generated from the affective intensities experienced by the performer ritualist and the spectator celebrant. The confluence of affective intensities constitutes, in Gilles Deleuze's term, an assemblage, a third and independent order of being, what Deleuze in his notoriously oblique diction refers to as a plane of immanence, or a body without organs. Okay. Thank you.